Top 10 Bizarre False Confessions to Horrible Murders. Welcome back to Creepshow, where we dive into the dark and twisted corners of true crime, paranormal mysteries, and the eerie tales that keep you up at night. Today, we're uncovering the unbelievable stories behind 10 bizarre false confessions to horrible murders. These are the cases where innocent people found themselves behind bars for crimes they didn't commit, driven by fear, manipulation, or even their own delusions. So grab your flashlight and join me as we explore these mind-boggling confessions that shook the justice system to its core. Let's get started. A list of 10 bizarre and fabricated confessions to heinous murders. It sounds like a really weird thing to do, to confess to a murder that you did not commit, and then subject yourself to either death or a lifetime in jail for your actions. Even though it is not unheard of, it is still a possibility, and those individuals who do offer false confessions do it for their own personal reasons. There are times when it is brought to light and justice is carried out, and there are instances when it isn't. Number 10. Laverne Pavlinac. There aren't that many people who feel the need to falsely confess to a murder in order to get out of a relationship, but it can be difficult to end a connection with someone. Tonja Bennett, who was 23 years old at the time of her murder, was beaten, raped, and strangled to death outside of Portland, Oregon in the year 1990. Laverne Pavlinac began her weird journey of false admissions after the tragic events that occurred. In the end, she decided to get in touch with the authorities on her own when her tips to the police failed to raise any notice. Her initial account stated that her boyfriend of 10 years, John Sosnovsky, was the one who had committed the murder of the girl. However, when she was brought in for interrogation, the 52-year-old woman stated that she and Sosnovsky had been involved in the crime and that she had assisted him in disposing of the body. She actually performed fairly well when the authorities tried to persuade her to identify locations and information that hadn't been made public, and she did so well enough that they both ended up being detained. Despite the fact that they were claiming innocence at that time, they proceeded to trial with evidence that included her taped confessions. Pavlinac made an attempt to retract her testimony during the trial by claiming that she had simply confessed in an effort to break free from her relationship with Sosnovsky. Her original testimony and her luck in pointing out crime scene sites led to her conviction in 1991. Her conviction was based on both of these factors. Sosnovsky, who was tried separately, entered a plea of no contest in an effort to eliminate the possibility of receiving a death sentence. Each of them was given a sentence of life in prison. A few years later, things became more problematic after Keith Jesperson, also known as the Happy Face Killer, confessed to the crime and demonstrated that he was more capable of recognizing crime scene sites and information than Pavlinac had been. Following Jesperson's confession, Pavlinac's daughter stated that this was not the first time she had attempted to confess to crimes and implicate Sosnovsky in the commission of those crimes. Moreover, she had attempted to get him arrested for a bank robbery. However, the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not take her confession seriously. Number 9. Henry Lee Lucas. In the year 1983, Henry Lee Lucas was taken into custody in the state of Texas. In a short amount of time, he admitted to having committed as many as 600 killings, which was a significant departure from the accusation of possessing illegal firearms that had first led to his detention. When it comes to the subject of how many murders Lucas can genuinely be linked to, the answer is very complicated. Physical evidence has shown a direct connection between him and 2 homicides. George W. Bush, who was serving as governor at the time, successfully overturned a death sentence for 10 murders in 1998, one of which being the infamous Orange Socks case. Lucas became the willing scapegoat for a large number of additional crimes while he was incarcerated, and it is not even clear how many of these instances he confessed to. The number of confessions is estimated to be between 360 and 600, but since he was caught in clear lying regarding several of them, those confessions became rather questionable. However, this did not prevent law enforcement from gathering confessions and closing cases, which is the primary issue brought about by Lucas's fake admissions. In exchange for his admissions, Lucas was rewarded not only with recognition, but also with amenities such as improved food, more comfortable mattresses, and jail privileges. He found that life in the spotlight was a good fit for him. In a subsequent confession, he admitted that he had been hunting for officers who wanted to close cases. He also admitted that he was skilled at extracting information from investigators and then feeding it back to them in a manner that was plausible. The unfortunate reality is that, after his lies were exposed, a significant number of the instances that he admitted to were never revisited. Later on, while he was incarcerated, he went on record as admitting that he enjoyed watching murder investigations on television. He also stated that he would have confessed to the deaths of Rafael Resende Ramirez if he hadn't been positively linked to 8 further murders. Number 8. John Mark Karr. In the year 2006, John Mark Karr admitted to being the person responsible for the death of John Benet Ramsey, a child beauty queen. Furthermore, his confession shed light on a peculiar world. There were a number of peculiar things about him, including his 2 marriages to teenage females, one of whom was only 13 years old, and his past occupations as a nanny to 3 young girls in Germany. Despite the fact that one of his ex-wives testified that he was obsessed with the case, she also testified that he had been living with her in Alabama at the time of the murder and that he had not been engaged in the crime. Karr made a career transition from real estate to teaching in 1996, the same year that the murder occurred. He worked at schools all around the country, but even that work was questioned in terms of its genuineness. After being arrested for possessing child pornography, he worked as a substitute teacher for a period of time. Nevertheless, this activity came to an abrupt halt immediately after his arrest. Following the filing of a restraining order against him by his ex-wife, he relocated to a foreign country in order to find work as a teacher. It was during this time that he arrived to his confession. It wasn't long before detectives started to dissect his statement, which was obviously a fabrication. One of the things they did was question his assertion that he had picked her up from school on the actual day that she was murdered. It's strange that that wasn't the last time we heard about Karr. 2010 was the year that he reappeared, this time in the midst of charges that he was allegedly recruiting young girls between the ages of 4 and 8 to join his cult, which was apparently known as the Immaculates. Samantha Spiegel, Sam Spiegel's ex-fiancée, is the one who made the allegations, but it has been difficult to verify them. According to reports, Karr had vanished from public view and was reportedly residing under the guise of a lady named Alexis Valoran Reich, surrounded by a group of associates who assist him in remaining hidden from the public eye. Number 7. Jerry Pacek. At the time of his confession, which would forever alter the course of his life, Jerry Pacek was only 13 years old when he admitted responsibility for the murder and rape of Lillian Stavik, who was 52 years old at the time. Pacek had been walking home from the residence of his fiancée at approximately midnight when he witnessed a person fleeing from another individual who was still alive and wailing. 25 minutes after being transported to the hospital, Stavik passed away, and Pacek was taken in for interrogation at that time. First, they explained to him that the reason was solely due to the fact that he was the one who discovered the victim. However, 17 hours later, he admitted to having killed her. Initially, the murder weapon had not been discovered, and he initially claimed that he had killed her with a metal object. However, when the police discovered a rusty hatchet a football field's length away from her body, Pacek revised his tale to fit the evidence that they had. Following his performance of the murder in the courts in 1959, he was found guilty of the crime and charged as an adult. In addition to serving 10 years, he was released from prison after his attorney had dropped his appeal without informing him of the decision. In the course of subsequent investigations into the case, evidence, or the absence of evidence, that ought to have been presented at the trial was discovered. Despite the fact that the victim had obviously engaged in combat with her assailant, his clothing was spotless, and he did not reveal any signs of defensive wounds or scratches. As far as Pacek was concerned, he had merely confessed in order to safeguard his lover. She was 20 years old at the time, and his parents had previously taken legal action against her by issuing a restraining order. He was under the impression that if he confessed, he would be able to get her out of danger and be able to unequivocally demonstrate his innocence at the trial. In spite of the fact that he sat down with a sketch artist to generate pictures of the man he had seen, no one else was ever caught, and his civil complaint for wrongful conviction was unsuccessful. Number 6. Sture Bergwall. Among the most prominent and prolific serial killers to originate from Sweden, Thomas Quick was one of the most notorious. Through his confessions in the 1990s, he admitted to committing multiple murders, providing the authorities and the media with every gruesome detail that they could possibly desire. He claimed that he had murdered and eaten a young girl who was 9 years old, that he had slain a Dutch couple when they were on a camping trip, and that he had murdered Johan Asplund, who was 11 years old and had vanished on his way to school in the year 1980. Quick claims that he first suffocated the youngster, then dismembered him, and finally buried his remains in a secluded spot where they would not be discovered. This was all done after he had consumed the boy's fingers. The location that Quick had referred them to was devoid of any remnants, and there was a clear reason for this. He was just lying. When Quick changed his identity back to his real name, Sture Bergwall, there were more than 50,000 pages of court paperwork. This was due to the fact that the stories he gave were so comprehensive. It wasn't until he stopped collaborating and psychologists started looking over the files that they recognized that although there was a lot of discussion, there wasn't actually any physical proof to corroborate any of his allegations. This realization came about after he stopped cooperating. He had already been sent to the Sture Psychiatric Hospital for the criminally insane by that point in time. In 2008, he admitted that he had fabricated the entire circumstance. Following the publication of a book that brought to light the deficiencies in the case, as well as the absence of tangible evidence, the matter was brought back before the courts. He just stated that he had been lonely, and he had discovered that the more horrific things a person did, the more attention they got, and the more intriguing everyone thought that they were. This was his response when he was questioned why he would confess to so many murders if he was innocent. It didn't matter to him if he got the details right or wrong once he started confessing. He even referred to one of his victims as a blonde girl from a rural town when, in reality, she was a metropolitan girl with dark hair. His convictions were based on poor evidence, including a piece of bone that turned out to be wood. However, he did get one thing right, and that was public knowledge. In 2013, he was ultimately found not guilty of the final murder charge against him, leaving relatives with a great deal of unresolved issues and concerns that have not been answered. Number 5. Paul Ingram. In addition to being a devoted member of the local Pentecostal church and a deputy sheriff for the state of Washington, Paul Ingram was a married father of 5 children. In the year 1988, his daughters made allegations against him, claiming that he had raped them, that he had participated in satanic rituals, and that he had sacrificed 25 infants during the rites. Erica, One of his daughters even asserted that she was pregnant and that he had taken the nearly full-term baby from her in order to sacrifice it. She claimed that he had done this without her knowledge. After being taken into custody, Ingram went through a period of 5 months during which he swung from rejecting the claims to eventually admitting that everything was true. It was after a series of interrogations, during which he was hypnotized, and after his pastor persuaded him to confess, claiming that there was no way the girls could make up such horrific things, that he confessed. Despite the fact that he claimed he was unable to recall much about any of the episodes, he confessed. It was then that he started to narrate the events that they had told him had taken place, claiming that they would never lie about such matters and that he had in fact coerced his daughter into having an abortion and carried out a variety of nefarious rites. Eventually, a consulting psychologist became dubious of the entire situation and offered to Ingram a different scenario that his daughters had not in any way suggested had occurred. A few days later, when he admitted to having fabricated this situation, it became immediately apparent that he had very little control over the words that he was uttering. After that, Ingram made an attempt to retract his admissions, but the courts did not allow him to do so. As a result, he accepted his 20-year sentence as divine discipline. Number 4. Jerry Frank Townsend and Frank Lee Smith. In both cases, Eddie Lee Mosley was the true perpetrator of the murders that were committed by Frank Lee Smith and Jerry Frank Townsend, who both made false confessions when they were convicted of murder. The year 1979 saw Townsend taken into custody and charged with rape. Despite the fact that Townsend was diagnosed with the mental skills of a child of 8 years old, he went ahead and confessed to a string of killings that had been taking place all over the state of Florida. His confessions, which are now believed to have been uttered in an effort to appease the authority figures that he regarded as the police, were recorded by the police when they escorted him to the places of the crimes. As a result of his confessions, he was found guilty of 7 murders and sentenced to 22 years in prison. Nevertheless, he was exonerated of all of the charges in the year 2001. In 1998, the mother of one of his alleged victims made a plea to the police that they conduct a second investigation into the crime. This was the beginning of his exoneration. By the year 2000, DNA evidence confirmed that Mosley, and not Townsend, was responsible for the murders. In contrast, Frank Lee Smith would never be able to witness his exoneration because he passed away from cancer while incarcerated in the year 2000. It was on the basis of laughably poor evidence that he had been arrested and convicted of the murder of Chandra Whitehead. The evidence consisted of little more than the testimony of one eyewitness who identified him as the person that she had seen in the neighborhood around the time that the murder took place. The confession that Smith made was not even close to being a normal one, and it was not so much from him as it was from the officers who had taken his statement. According to the cops, Smith made a statement that was incriminating while he was being questioned, but there were no records of the actual confession. A witness then recanted her identification and instead identified a picture of Mosley, which was an accusation that did not come in time for Smith to be released from prison. This occurred 4 years later. Number 3. Stephen Downing. The trial and conviction of Stephen Downing, who was just 17 years old at the time, was a particularly egregious instance of injustice that lasted for 30 years. When Downing was arrested for the murder of Wendy Sewell in 1973, the police were able to secure a signed confession from him. Sewell was a local girl who had a reputation that was less than outstanding. She was severely battered in the graveyard of a nearby church, which was where she frequently spent her lunch break seeing whichever local boy had most recently caught her attention. Downing was the one who discovered her and ran to the gatehouse of the cemetery in order to get assistance. It was just in time for the paramedics to come and transport her to the hospital, where she ultimately succumbed to her injuries a few days later. Downing was brought into custody, but he was not had the opportunity to consult with an attorney or told of his rights. Later on, he would be evaluated as a 17-year-old with learning difficulties and the reading ability of an 11-year-old according to the results of the evaluation. When he finally signed the confession that the police had written for him, it was written in words that he could not understand. This occurred after 9 hours of questioning. Downing's attempt to recant his statement, which he had signed prior to Sewell's passing, was denied, despite the fact that there were very few people in the town who believed that he was even remotely capable of killing. He would eventually serve 27 years in prison for the crime that he did not commit, and it is quite probable that he would still be incarcerated if the editor of the local newspaper, Don Hale, had not received a request to re-examine the case. It seemed like the more he dug, the more he discovered that was incorrect. In addition, he discovered a woman who had witnessed a van parked close to the cemetery, as well as a pair of males who were acting in a suspicious manner. Despite the fact that she had jotted down the license number, the cops had refused to let her in. Neither did Hale. Downing was granted his freedom in 2003 and was warmly welcomed back into the community, which had long harbored the belief that he was innocent. Number 2. Ed Brown, Henry Shields, and Arthur Ellington. Following the murder of Raymond Stewart on March 30, 1934, the city of Giles, Mississippi, became a target of racial profiling and mob violence. Once Brown, Shields, and Ellington were identified as the individuals under suspicion, law enforcement agents made an effort to coerce Ellington into confessing to the crime with the assistance of an enraged mob. Despite being subjected to severe torture and having an attempt made on his life, Ellington continued to refuse to confess to the crime that he had not committed. If Ellington were to confess to the murder the following day, he would be exposed to other forms of torture at the hands of police authorities, including a flogging by the deputy sheriff. On the following day, the same deputy sheriff was assisted by a few people in the beating and interrogation of Brown and Shields, which ultimately resulted in their being coerced into making confessions. It was on April 1st when the confessions were released. Following the official filing of charges against all three on April 4th, the trial took place on April 5th, and the verdict of guilty and the execution of the sentence was handed down on April 6th. When the case was finally brought before the Supreme Court on January 10, 1936, it was a momentous occasion that brought about a profound transformation in the way law enforcement is carried out in the United States. When it comes to the issue of due process of law, the treatment and torture of the so-called Kemper Country Trio led to the determination that all individuals, regardless of their race, are allowed the same rights and safeguards. The decision that was reached in the case of Brown v. Mississippi was a landmark one, particularly when seen in the context of the time and location. There were roughly twice as many lynchings committed in Kemper County as there were in any other county in Mississippi. Due process was granted to all parties involved, and the trial also prohibited the use of coercive confessions. In the history of the nation, this was the very first time that a court had ever deliberated on the matter. Number 1. Robert Hubert. London's landscape was irrevocably altered as a result of the Great Fire that occurred in 1666. As the scared citizens of London picked up the pieces, they demanded to know what had happened, and they demanded that someone be held accountable for what had occurred. At the end of it all, the official death toll from the fire was only 6, but the unofficial death toll could range anywhere from several hundred to several thousand people. 70% of London's 80,000 residences were destroyed by the fire. Due to the fact that England was at war with France and the Netherlands at the time, it appeared to be highly probable that the fire had been nothing less than an act of terrorism. It appeared as though the fire in London was an unfathomable coincidence, given that the British Navy had just recently set fire to the city of West Terschelling in the Netherlands. King Charles proclaimed it to be an act of God, and the Duke of York was required to go out into the city in order to put a stop to the growing number of hangings that were occurring everywhere. A scapegoat was required in order to maintain peace, and they were able to find one when Robert Hubert admitted that he was the one who started the fire with the assistance of 23 other individual conspirators. Hubert, a French Protestant watchmaker, was taken into custody not long after the fire occurred when he was discovered attempting to flee the city through the city. Furthermore, he admitted that the planning for the fire had begun in the year 1665. The act was carried out by him and 2 other individuals by lighting a ball of gunpowder and brimstone and then tossing it through the window of the bakery it was being committed. Neither the fact that there was no window where he claimed to have been and the fact that his accomplices were never discovered affected the outcome. There were a few more versions of his story that were told before he was brought before the Old Bailey for trial. In spite of the fact that the Lord Justice stated that he did not believe the confession, Hubert was considered a scapegoat and ultimately executed by hanging. After being handed over to the mob, his body was ripped to shreds by the crowd. After the fact, a ship captain testified that Hubert had been at sea with him when the fire started. This information was not first disclosed. After a period of 3 months, the entirety of the event was formally deemed to be an accident by Parliament. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey through some of the most bizarre false confessions in history. If you found these stories as fascinating and haunting as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more creepy content. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an episode of Creepshow. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on these cases or any other strange confessions you'd like me to cover. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and keep the lights on. This is Creepshow, signing off.